A thank you to John for sharing his photography skills and his views about prayer being, bigger and more creative than sometimes that we acknowledge that it can be. So thank you for doing this. And now I'm going to mute everybody, and then John can unmute himself.
We're ready to go? Okay. Well, I think we have about 10 folks on the line at the moment, and there may be some other folks yet joining, but that will just happen in due course. So thank you for being here. Welcome. This is a bit of an experiment in Zoom for me. I've not done anything like this before. We did this workshop last year in person and had a great time. Part of that great time was sitting around and eating snacks and just enjoying the social company. And now we live in a different world. In some ways, this is very manageable, and content is pretty well suited, I think, for this format. But I hope that one day we'll be able to all sit around in a big room together again and do a workshop that way. I thank everybody for emailing me your interests and a sense of what cameras you're going to use. Most of the people who will be joining tonight are using smartphones, and that is completely fine if that works for you. If anybody has any doubt the capacity of a modern smartphone, I would encourage you to go to the iPhone Photo Awards website, ippawards.com, and you can see some astounding photography there, all done with an iPhone. I've occasionally taken pictures with an iPhone myself, even though I have other cameras. For one thing, the best camera you have is the camera you have with you. So it doesn't matter what camera you have that's sitting on a table at home. If you've got a camera with you, that's the camera to use. Smartphones are limited in some ways just by physics, by the size of the sensor and the size of the lenses, but they can do an awful lot. They're also limited a bit in how they try to do everything automatically for you. And so that gives you limited capacity to control what you really want, because you're always battling against what it's assuming that you want to see. But they're great little cameras. And so we have with us today folks who have smartphones, folks that have advanced point and shoots, and folks that have professional cameras. Hopefully what we'll be doing will be of interest to all. I'm going to just offer a few comments here at the outset of the context of contemplative photography. I won't be spending a lot of time on that because it will be an underlying theme of what we'll be doing both this time and in the next session. But I want to offer some comments, and then we're going to spend most of the time just looking at some camera techniques that are geared toward the idea of contemplative photography, but I think will be valuable beyond that context, just in general, help you to think about how to take better pictures. One of the things that just about everybody had said in their emails to me was they were interested in taking better pictures. So we want to accommodate that. So I want to say a little bit about the idea of contemplative photography. It's both a style of photography that has a meditative quality. It's also a means for seeing, I think, the richness of the world around us. The camera is a particular tool in that process. Cameras don't really record what you see. They never record what you see. They record something maybe close to what you see. They can't exactly duplicate the experience of the human eye. And that fact can be a little frustrating if we want it to record exactly what we see, but it can also be that the slight differences, or sometimes the great differences of the way that a camera can see things, can help expand our sense of what's around us, expand our sense of vision, help us to see things in different ways, to see the world around us maybe with more depth and subtlety, just from the fact that we're viewing it at a different angle and in a different way. From my own practice of photography, especially contemplative photography, I have in my mind's eye options of how I see the world around me. Just from being used to that. As I'm looking at a scene, I can pretty much imagine in my mind what it's going to look like with a wide angle lens, or with a normal lens, or with a telephoto lens. and how each of those lenses has its own characteristics. And so that gives me, I think, a greater sense of the visual world around me. I imagine what I'm seeing with a wide-angle lens before I move the wide-angle lens up to my eye. And I try as much as possible to make that an alignment so that I'm not seeing something jarringly different in my mind. People ask me how I see things that are interesting to photograph, and to a large extent, I'd say my camera has taught me to see things in new and interesting ways. And as you get in tune with how your camera sees the world, I think you will be able to see in your own mind those different ways as well. That's part of the enrichment of that. How much you choose to emphasize the contemplative part of contemplative photography or the photography part of contemplative photography is up to you. But I think those two things are related very closely. The better you are at taking pictures, the more you'll be attuned to the visual world around you. And the more you're aware of the visual world around you, the better you are at taking pictures. So I think it all comes together. The nice thing about digital photography is that you can take 100 pictures and it costs no more than to take a single picture. So you can play around, you can really experiment with the camera in a way that back many years ago was both impractical and expensive to do when you had a film camera and you had to wait a week for the film to come back developed, and it cost a lot of money for each roll. So there's a lot of potential, I think. I resisted digital photography for a long time, but I'm now fully on board, shall we say. So another word particularly around contemplative side of things here. And I've sent you a handout with an overview of some points of the basic concept. And those handouts are really something that stand alongside of this workshop. They're not something we're going to cover in detail, but they do apply to what we're doing. So think of those as sort of ancillary notes, footnotes, additional notes, if you will, to what we're talking about. And if you have any questions around the points of those handouts, then we can talk about that. But we're not going to be going through those handouts. So how might you best take in your surroundings is maybe the first question of contemplative photography. How do you become attuned to what's around you in order to figure out what to photograph and then get that process started? And one way, I think, is just very simply to pause and let the richness of the world around you, whether it be from a chair or from a standing position in a garden or overlooking some particular scene, just sort of pause and let the wonder of the world soak into you. Let it intrigue you, let it delight you. Let something of that scene in front of you capture your attention, speak to you, stand out to you in that way. And then try to explore that particular thing that stood out to you with the camera. And it's really just that straightforward. It is a way of using the camera to help us focus on the richness of the world around us, the richness of creation. It's curious to me, and it just continues to be a phenomenon that you can sit or stand somewhere and look at some scene for 10 minutes and suddenly something will stand out to your attention that's really wonderful that you just did not notice for the first 9 minutes. It takes a while for us to process all that's coming our way, I think. And once that has happened and you focus on that, then use the camera to slow your attention down even more to see what's there. A lot of what I do is macro photography or close-up photography. And that allows me to really see tiny things that were beyond my notice from a general view. The photographic techniques we're going to talk about give, I think, a practical sense of this whole process. But let me just ask in general, for those of you who joined us, what do you think of this idea of using a camera to aid a process of contemplation, if you will, of a spiritual nourishment? How does that strike you? Anybody have any comments up front? You'll need to unmute yourself, remember, in order to speak.
Well, I think that anything that allows us to see outside of our everyday vision is good. I think it helps to teach us compassion and how to put ourselves in someone else's place. And I think it expands our imagination. I think it's good.
I would agree. I would even put forward in my own definition of spirituality, that which expands our sense of the world and aliveness. And so
Yeah.
this is connected to that.
I've always felt like photography for me personally is a form of spirituality. It's a form of worship. For me, I mean, not everybody approaches it that way, but I can't separate my love for photography from my love of the world. And I use it to communicate that love and that hope.
Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts from people? Well, we can move into some techniques here, and feel free to comment along the way. Remember that you do need to unmute yourself if you want to give a comment. So what I'm going to do for most of our remainder of our time here is to go to a screen share process, and you will see hopefully the whole screen will be this presentation. Is that what people are seeing? Excellent. So I want to cover 7 points of camera technique tonight, and some of these you may have your own opinions about. Most of these are things that one can do with a smartphone, a sophisticated camera, a professional camera, maybe to one extent or another, a little more or less, but these are all things that are, I think, applicable to everybody. And so the first point I want to make is that photographs are not so much taken as they are made. And if you think about photography the way you might think about painting, and you think about a photograph the way you might think about a painting, is something very intentionally created. And if you have that in mind, it gives, I think, most people a different sense of how to frame up an image. It pulls us away from the idea that the camera simply documents something in front of us, and pulls us toward the idea of how the photographer is also an artist. You choose when to click the shutter, you choose how to frame it up, you choose the settings of the camera, you choose what it's going to look like to a great extent. You can affect an image even by the slightest adjustment of your position. And I offer this as an example. This is a pair of lotuses in the morning sun. And I really struck me as this remarkable image. There are 2 very different types of lotus flowers there. The one up top has this very balletic sort of array of petals, and the one below a much more structured, compact layout of the petals there. What really caught my attention in looking at this was this remarkable little conical centerpiece in lotus flowers that you see at the center of the upper lotus there. I think that's called the receptacle in technical terms. It is an odd looking thing. It's very curious to me. And so I wanted this picture to be a picture of the flowers, but I wanted that to be a clear piece of it. And so I moved around till I found an opportunity for that to be in between the petals of the upper flower. And then sort of could move slightly up or down a little bit to adjust that. But that was my goal for that. And I think if that little receptacle part of the upper flower was not clearly in the picture fully, that it would be a very different picture. I think that's very central to what catches people's eyes at that. Oh, this is very interesting. There's different things to explore, the different types of petals, all that sort of thing. And then there's this curious thing at the top. So that was the way that I tried to imagine this. If I were painting this, would I paint that receptacle half covered? No. I would paint it there with the petals around it. And so I tried to frame up the picture so that that was also how the photograph would be. You have limits, obviously, of what you can do because you're not entirely creating the scene. You're working with what's in front of the camera. But I think it gives us a different perspective and a different process in the photography when we think of things as a painting. Now, you can move a little bit left or right, and you can change the scene. You can move a little bit up and down. You can change the scene. Vertical angles are often very striking for contemplative photography because we walk around pretty much with the same angle on everything. It is a few inches less than our height. And we may have a sense of what it means to sit and look at things, but by and large, we are used to sort of viewing things low to the ground from above. We're used to viewing things high up from below. And you start to change that a little bit and it becomes quite striking. And it allows us to, I think, see the world in a different way, to give the viewer and to give ourselves as a viewer a new sense of what eye level may be. So here, for instance, the photo I took just a few weeks back of this sort of large grass blade with the wonderful water droplets on it. Now, I could have taken that from above the way I originally saw it, or I could stoop down and take it straight on. And that is a slightly more unusual angle on something that is a fairly common little thing. It's a blade of grass. But here, I think the fact that I'm looking straight at it with the camera brings an unusual quality to it. And I might say that this is a good example of how contemplative photography allows you to capture something that can have meaning to you later, because I don't think I could have crouched down to see that for very, very long. And so I only was able to manage crouching down for a few seconds that way before I needed to stand up, but now I can enjoy it at any time. Here's another example of eye level, literally with eyes, sort of looking at the little froggy there. That is a fairly sort of intimate sense of the little frog. You're right up on it. And anything with eyes, any animals with eyes, any people with eyes, our eyes are drawn to their eyes. And so that should be that absolute crucial point for focusing. And if you notice here, the face and the eyes particularly are in focus. Everything else becomes a little less in focus as you move forward or backward from the position of the eyes. However, I would say that the single most effective way to create striking photographs is very simply to control the background. You may do that in many different ways, but controlling the background allows you to adjust the viewer's relationship of your central subject with all the stuff around it. I just took this little snapshot as an example. A nice little flower, take a picture of a flower. Nothing wrong with that picture of a flower. But now by moving just probably 6 inches to the left and slightly up, we have this flower. Same thing, same distance. I've just moved about 6 inches. This is probably a picture that will have greater impact because there is not the interference of the stuff around it as much. There's a lot of stuff that's still busy around that flower, but I've moved just to a point where that exists in the center of a fairly contrasty part of the image. If you look at the two side by side, you can see, I don't know, you may have a different sense of which one you prefer, but the slight differences that way can add up when you're taking a picture. We talk about taking a picture and having someone or something photobomb it. It means something intruding into it. And in many ways, what we're trying to do is to create images where it's clear what is our subject, and we're not allowing other things in the background to photobomb our image. Obviously, the simplest way to do this is to find a very plain background. And so this is another lotus flower, actually, taken with the background simply being the blue water behind it. So there's no question that that's going to be directly your attention. There's a little undulation in the water that may be, give it some variation in the background, but nothing is really there to distract you from the thing that I wanted to be the center of attention. Sometimes you deal with very complex backgrounds, and here there's not a whole lot different between the flower in the front and the structures in the back, except size and color. And color is another way to distinguish what is your central subject with what's in the background. Here, though, you probably can't really tell, but I did try to find the least distracting little area of that background in order to center the flower itself. There's some large blades in the background on either side of it, but they aren't actually intersecting it through it. There are some smaller blades even further in the background, less in focus, that sort of interfere a little bit with the structure of the flower. But by and large, this image, while quite busy, allows you to be very clear about what is the focus of what's going on. This was a single flower in a large bed of this other light green foliage, really very beautiful, and I tried as best I could to capture that singularity in this image. Sometimes you just can't get away from a busy background, and in this particular case, I was fascinated by this one particular leaf. I don't know why one leaf will stand out to me on an entire tree, but it does. And so I wanted to try to capture that in great detail. There was a lot of busy background, and so in order to really get around that, the only way that I could really work is just to try to fill the frame with the leaf so that it dominates the background, and the background can't compete as much against it. Here we have a little fern frond taken in front of forsythia bush, I believe. And you have some other stuff going on in the background, but you have very clearly what is the subject. My eye is drawn into the coil of this particular fern frond. There is this interesting, and I could not avoid this very bright line underneath it, but I figured that was actually all right, and the line actually is somewhere around a third up the frame, and we'll talk about a rule of thirds later on as to how that tends to draw our eye. Here's another fern frond with my preferred dark background. This is a technique that I've worked on for a good long while to try to find something that is lit well by the sun, but that I can photograph against a dark background. And it may be that smartphone cameras won't have quite the capacity to do this as a more sophisticated camera, but you can spot meter the light that's just on the thing that is the center of attention there. I know that my iPhone can do that by pointing at exactly the item that you want to highlight, and it allows you to adjust the brightness or dimness of the image according to the way that you wish for that. More sophisticated cameras allow you to meter a single spot in what's happening there. And that allows you to take advantage of the difference between the brightness of what's in front of the center of the camera and the relative darkness to what's behind. Every camera is going to have a different capacity for dynamic range, how much the camera can really process from very bright to very dim. Generally, it's seen in the world of photography that you want as much dynamic range as possible. I actually like fairly limited dynamic range in order to highlight the contrast. And so I actually, while I have a fairly sophisticated camera, I actually set the contrast fairly high on that. so that I limit the dynamic range so that I can take these pictures that personally appeal to me. Now, sometimes I try to find a dark background to photograph against, and I can't find a solid background, but I can find some little patch to photograph against. I also use a telephoto lens in order to narrow my angle of view, and we'll talk a little about lenses a little later on. But here, this was the scene that I originally took, trying to find a dark background to photograph this lit fern frond against. That dark background is actually a tree that's about maybe 8 inches in diameter, about 3 feet behind. But it served my purpose. And so this is a sort of an interesting image, but you can always crop an image later if you can't fully control the background just at the time you're taking the picture. And so while this is a sort of interesting image, here is the image that I ended up with. So again, a very dramatic contrast, floating in space, if you will. And my eye is drawn to the marvelous detail of this little fern frond. That same sort of technique of contrasting the bright image against a dark background here, you may be able, depending upon what your computer is able to let you to see, you can see a little bit of the foliage around it, almost ghost-like, very barely visible. However, your computer screen may show it just simply against a black background, I'm not sure. This daisy and interesting dramatic sunlight sort of shining out in a fully lit room, but against at that particular angle a dark area. Here's a more dramatic example of that same technique, which is a bird of paradise flower, and again, fully brightly lit room, a dark little patch behind. Was able to focus in and get the exposure right on the very translucent petals there, and then let everything else recede into the background. You can see that the translucence of those petals is in contrast with the very matte appearance of the other part of the flower off to the lower left-hand side there. There is an element of this style of photography that looks like studio photography. And I'm guessing that if you were really talented with studio lighting, you could reproduce this as a studio image. But I find that there's a really interesting quality to natural sunlight and natural lighting that when you combine it with this sort of studio-like effect gives you something that's very different from most of the things that you see with studio lighting. And one final example here of the same sort of process, this water lily, the water is very dark and it's reflecting a building behind that's creating a deep shadow, allowing me for a great contrast there as well. You can see a little bit of the reflection in the water in front, lower left of the water lily there. But generally that water is almost like it's floating in space. Very contrasty image. One other thing though here, sort of to reverse the thought, here I'm taking a picture with simply an iPhone. The sky is normally a background thing, but I decided that this was an interesting idea of taking the skylight so that the background sort of thing that we normally think of a sky to become the object, and then to create the ceiling of the, this is a Quaker meeting house, to be essentially the background to the sky. The skylight is curved, and I thought it had an interesting design, very slight and subtle. Reminds me a little bit of something like a magic carpet of sky floating in the void of space or something like that. Yeah, this was taken with, I believe, an iPhone 3G, very early model iPhone. Had a very limited dynamic range, and I made use of that. That black area around the skylight is actually a completely white ceiling in this Quaker meeting house. But once you tell the camera to look at just the sky, then that contrast is going to black out anything that is less bright. Does anybody have any thoughts around any of these images, or the thought around how to control the background and how to take advantage of contrasts?
They talk about like contrasting light and dark.
Could you speak up a little more, Hannah?
They talk about contrasting light and dark in art too,
Yes.
which did remind me of the thinking about it as a painting that
Yep.
you talked about earlier.
There's my theme of painting, yes.
So you're getting that from spot metering.
Yep.
You're metering right on the object, the image.
Right. In this case, it was a very bright sky. So in order for that to get under control, the camera had to really darken everything down, and that darkened that white ceiling down to almost black. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I was surprised at the effect, frankly. I didn't think it would become that contrasty. Okay, well, let's move on a little bit for a few other things. The next thing I'd like to emphasize is the value of patterns and lines that draw and guide the eye. This is a photograph of fairly early, one of the early photographs I took with a digital camera when I bought a little cheap digital camera some years back. I was just amazed at how the more I looked at this flower and sort of relaxed my eye, the more the outer purple ring became apparent to me, very much like a bullseye. And I was just enchanted by that, and tried to take a picture of it and was relatively successful in that. This pattern really draws me directly into the center of that flower. It's a very centering image, if you will. We are naturally attuned to any sort of patterns in our mind. And so this is a circular pattern that I found to be just quite striking, and I wanted to capture. One of my favorite images. Another simple example of, this was again taken with a pretty inexpensive little digital camera, but I wanted to try to convey the sense of the magnitude of this giant redwood. And so in order to do that, I tried to both get as close to it as I could to emphasize the gigantic nature of it, and then I went around the tree to find the way that the bark sort of had the lines curving up it that helped guide my eye further to the top. So just another way of looking for line in an image. Pretty obvious what this is. Drawing your attention along those lines. This is a palm, and you'll notice here, and we'll start to talk a little more about directionality in images, but certainly this is an image that, at least for me, draws me from the lower left to the upper right of that image along those lines. There is a theory in photography that our eyes naturally follow a directionality that relates to the way we're used to reading, so that there's a predilection for people who read left to right to view an image of left to right more strongly than they would right to left. I don't know, it depends on the image, depends many factors involved, but I do know that much of my photography does favor a left to right directionality in this case. Here we have another left to right directionality, but a very different sense of line as your eye follows the march of these emerging little fern fronds here, aided by the directionality of the fully extended leaves behind. So my eye is drawn to sort of move in a slightly curved way from the lower left to follow those emerging little features uncurling there from left to right. Here is a very simple image that again has a certain directionality of left to right. I'm fascinated by reflections, and so this also has a directionality, I think, of top to bottom. The top is more brightly lit than the reflection beneath, and then there's this curious little pattern that catches my eye at the lower right, the little concentric circles in the water that have come from one of the guppies in the water below, disturbing the water that way. Here we have a way in which the general line of the background leaf pulls the eye toward the dramatic flower. I don't often shoot in black and white, but in this particular case, it really worked well, being a white flower, and allowed for a lot of contrast that way. So there's other stuff going on in that image. Maybe if I painted this picture, I wouldn't have quite as much other stuff going on in the image, but I still imagined this as a portrait, and thought, how would that be to photograph in that particular way? Of course, the eye is also drawn not only to patterns and lines, but to their disruption. We are naturally drawn to patterns and lines, so we're attuned to them, but also when they're disrupted, it catches our attention. Here's a recent photograph of a stand of trees that just were filled with energy, in my opinion, and I tried to capture that as best I could. It looked almost to me like the little floor of the forest was a dance floor, and they were all dancing there. The chaotic interference pattern of all those trees draws my attention just as much as if they were entirely in a straight line, I think, maybe even more so. Here we have a palm that was brightly lit, backlit, caught my attention. I had an opportunity to think of what kind of background I wanted to use with that. I couldn't find a plain background, and so I tried to center it on the regularity of a full palm fan behind, so that it cuts across. Again, there's sort of a lot going on in this image, but it's pretty clear that our eyes are drawn to this bright thing, and then the sort of the perpendicular cut across the image in the background, the pattern in the background isn't, at least to me, isn't really distracting as much as it is allowing for me to highlight this bold, brightly lit piece in the front. There's also the color combination there and the bright reds. I'm not a painter, but I've been told by painters that you reserve red for special occasions to draw the eye, that red draws the eye. And so I do pay attention to reds. Reds are often very difficult to photograph, by the way. They tend to be hard to expose. Here we have another pattern and interference pattern both together. There's both the regularity and interference in this combination of I guess this is some sort of palm tree. There's light and dark, there's depth there. It's an intriguing image to me, even though it's to one degree it's fairly simple. It's even maybe a little dull. On another way, there's just an awful lot going on there that's fascinating to me. And here we have another example of an interference of a pattern, the main pattern being this palm fan in front with this regularity, and then you have the shadows of another palm projected on it from behind that have a very wild look. And there's a tremendous contrast in the energy, I think, between the regularity of the pattern in the front and the wildness of the pattern interfering with it from behind. This is a very animated image to me. The images behind strike me as birds or snakes or something that is very animated, and that animated quality is highlighted for me by how it is set against the regularity of the pattern up front. Um, I want to say a little bit about some shadow work and the like, but once again, I'll pause here. Any other thoughts from anyone on this so far? I'll mention that this slide presentation will be available to you after the fact, so that if you have an interest to go back and view any of this, you can. Well, press ahead a little more then to say that I think that one of the wonders of contemplative photography is to help us to admire the play of light in shadows and how sharply angular light can present dramatic images. This is a simple picture of a Himalayan poppy. The center is brightly lit, and that caught my attention as a contrast between the brightly lit center and the darker shaded areas of the flower. And yet, if you look at the back, what's really interesting to me, and what I explored and really discovered more with my camera than my first notice of the flower, was how the very sharply angular light of the afternoon was projecting that center piece of the flower onto the backlit petal. And so that became sort of a discovery as I looked more around the flower with my camera, and then decided to take this picture. Sharply angular light really brings out texture, and here we have a pretty mundane leaf, but in the dappled light and the sharply angular light of the afternoon, there's just a lot of depth going on there. There's a very dynamic image, I believe. I can look at this and really be drawn into the wonder of creation. There's the way that the little fringe is highlighted in the sunlight there that's pretty unnoticeable in other ways. This is a remarkable leaf that otherwise didn't look remarkable at all when the light was on it differently. This is I believe, a bird of paradise leaf that again doesn't look this way at all normally, but in sharply angular light and looking up very close to it, has this really textured textile look to me. It looks to me like some roll of burlap. The more I looked at it, the more I realized there was a whole lot to see than I originally appreciated. Here's another leaf in the late afternoon, and all the little nooks and crannies are dramatically brought out by the shadows that are there. Another example of how in much of my photography there is a left to right directionality. There is, to some degree, in my photography, a favoring of moving from lower left darker to higher right lighter. This would be a good example of that sort of a thing. With regard to shadows, this is a close-up of a sage leaf that I don't know how you're seeing this, because it's a bit of an optical illusion. It's a little bit like that test a while back of what color is the dress. Some people see this as convex, the flower, the leaf actually sort of jutting out towards you, and then some people see it as concave, like they're little depressions that are being highlighted. I don't know how anybody is seeing this. For me, 95% of the time, it is concave. And every now and then it suddenly pops in my vision to look entirely differently. And this is one of those rare examples of a photo that really does have a life of its own, because I can sit and look at it and it will change in front of me. Does anybody see it as convex, as coming out towards you? You do. My way to go, Mike and Hannah. Fabulous. So you may not be as surprised about this as some other people, but this is a wider angle on that same leaf. This is not a side-by-side. This is the actual full leaf. It's just half of it was angled in such a way to present a different type of shadows than the other half. And for me, at least, I see two entirely different images there. The one on the left being convex, the one on the right being very concave. So as I'm looking around, I'm attentive to shadows, and every now and then I find something that really is interesting this way to me. So again, I can't tell what you're able to see in this, but to me, that's fascinating. Sometimes shadows play in some humorous ways. This is what I see, at least, as sort of a suggestion of a face in the tree. Big nose, heavy eyebrows, maybe bushy beard. I walked past this tree and it just seemed like it looked at me for a moment, and I stopped and I retraced my steps, a couple of steps, went back, and this is what struck my attention. Again, I'm not sure if you see this as the way that I see it, but this was really sort of delightfully humorous to me. This was completely gone in a matter of seconds, because anything to do with shadows dealing with the sun are changing constantly. They change silently, and sometimes that makes it seem like that they shouldn't change so quickly, but they change constantly. One of the first things I learned in photography is that the sun moves through its diameter about every 3.5 minutes. And so there is a constant shift in the angle of the sun to what's happening in your field of view in a viewfinder. And so if you see something that is interesting about shadows, or if you go to take a picture of a sunset right on the horizon, just keep in mind that you need to act quickly, because it's going to change in a matter of seconds, not minutes really, but seconds. And then here is an example of the use of shadows to create, I think, a very dramatic and intimate effect. Again, another one of these palm leaves that I took at Longwood Gardens, where most of this has come from. So just having that little center section of that piece illuminated by the sun, the rest in shadow, set it against a very out of focus background of, again, another palm fan, so that it has this sort of crepuscular ray, subtle effect behind, like a sunburst. The combination of those things was interesting. And then I tried my best to actually wait until that shadow moved up the leaf just enough to allow those two central little white sections on the leaf that seemed oddly regular and in sync with the angle of the shadow to become centered into the sunlight that way. Now, if you look back at this leaf, one could say that among its qualities is there's a rough division into thirds, a center third, a left third, and a right third. And I want to say something about the rule of thirds, because you hear a lot about that in the world of photography. A lot of beginning photographers hear a lot about that. And I think it can be really interesting, but it is not something you need to feel constrained by. This is another example of trying to take a picture with sharp contrast, brightly lit powder puff flower there, sort of in two stages. This one fully in bloom, and the other one having lost the little petals, or whatever you call those things, in the powder puff. And that is, again, sort of has a directionality of left to right, bottom to top, if you will. But if you look at the image from the idea of dividing the scene into thirds, you get something like this, with that large, bright section sort of around an intersection of the top third. The other main feature of this image being sort of around the intersection of the bottom third. And the idea is that if you center things on those points of intersection, having divided an image into thirds vertically and horizontally, that there's a natural predilection of the eye to appreciate that off-centeredness, not as just off-centered, but as artistically pleasing. If you look at this example, for instance, I could have centered the photograph right with that center part of this water lily, sort of directly in front of you there. But I think by moving it a little bit to the left and to the bottom, to roughly somewhere around that bottom third intersection of lines, it gives a broader quality to it. It allows us to see that center section in relation more to the fan type outgrowth of the other petals. Here's another example, not necessarily at the bottom third, but over to the left-hand third, perhaps. By moving it to the side a little bit that way, I'm able to capture a bit of the sweep of the lines of the petals moving to the right. This is just a really interesting feature in the middle of this little poppy anemone, I believe it is. And so I could have taken a picture straight on with that, but in this case, by moving it off a little bit to the side, it gave me a different view altogether. The way I would suggest using the rule of thirds is to keep in mind, do I want to center this? Do I want to put the focus of my image in one of those points of intersection? Do I want to just move it over to a line vertically or horizontally to a third? And you can do this pretty quickly in a camera viewfinder or screen and see which one just strikes your fancy. And one may or may not strike your fancy more than another. You can even choose to take 3 different pictures or 4 different pictures with it around, again, the value of digital photography. But move the image around a little bit so that you begin to experience it. If this were a painting, what would I paint this? Would I paint this right in the middle of things? Or would I paint this in relation to the sweep of the lines of the petals behind? This is a landscape shot. I haven't really talked much about landscape photography, but here I was out on a boat in Alaska, and there's this really remarkable little sort of church-like structure there out on this ledge. And it seemed so odd to me that it seemed tiny, but it captured my attention completely. And I wanted to take a picture of that. I chose to frame that in such a way that it's about 1/3 of the way down or up from the bottom of that image. I have a contrast between the blue water and a little bit of the blue sky up above. The magnificence of the mountains behind, but where is my eye going to? It goes right to that little piece. And I have a friend who does street photography, a physician in Florida, who has a remarkable knack for taking pictures that have the center of attention being one of the smallest physical aspects of a scene, so that there'll be a large thing, but your eye is drawn to some very particular thing. It's very small in the photograph. He does that by contrast. He does that by focusing on people's eyes. So you can take a picture of a whole crowd, but you're instantly drawn to just one person in the crowd in a remarkable way. Here, not only is there contrast, but there's some red there that's drawing my eye down to that little piece. This is a image that I've looked at many times and just delights me because it's both odd and beautiful. And then I throw this image in because this was one of the very first photographs I ever took. I went to the local drugstore, and I think for $9.95 I bought a Kodak 110 pocket camera, and I had my parents drive me down to the local park where there was this little lake. And I went out there at sunset, and I was fascinated that I could take a picture of the sun through this tree. That gave an unusual effect. I was interested in the reflection in the lake. What's interesting to me now is that without really being very intentional about it, what appealed to me about the whole image was how it related to this foreground action piece, if you will, with the sun and the sky. And I pretty much applied the rule of thirds, maybe not off to the side, but vertically. That center of attention is about 1/3 of the way up the photograph. I think I was probably 11 or 12 when I took this picture. So I want to say a little about lenses next, but again, I'll pause and see if anybody has any thoughts. And is this valuable to you? Is this interesting? Is this useful to you? I hope so. Okay, we're sort of into the home stretch here. Let me say a little bit about zoom lenses, because most cameras all have zoom lenses anymore. And we tend to think of those as lenses that magnify or lenses that widen out. And that is a very limited way of thinking of zoom lenses, because each zoom lens with each focal length, from a wide angle to a normal to a telephoto to a super telephoto, each has its own character. If you put an individual lens that's a wide angle lens on a camera, and then you took it off and you put a telephoto lens on that camera, you're not just going to get a magnification, you're going to get a lens that has its own separate character. So the way we would normally think about a zoom lens would be, for instance, here's a general image, and you could zoom right in on that little section of the staging there, and you know, that's very nice that we can zoom in on that. That's wonderful. But is there another way we could think of making use of zoom lenses? And so here is a snapshot of some trees with this bench in front. This was taken from a fairly long distance away at a super telephoto focal length. And if you look at that, it's a picture of trees, and there's sort of a bench there. And I guess that's interesting. It's not really all that interesting to me. But say if I move a little closer to it, but then try to keep the bench the same size in the photo and adjust the zoom lens so that I'm not adjusting the magnification on the bench, I'm adjusting its relationship to what's in the background, again, controlling the background. So I move a little closer, and then I widen the lens out just a little bit more, and now the bench is about the same size, and now you get a sense of, well, there's a meadow there and not just those trees. Move a little closer, widen the lens out a little more. Now we have the bench about the same size, but you have an entirely different image of this bench and its situation at the top of a little rise in this meadow. Now, if you move a little closer and go to a wide angle lens, now you have a very broad view. This is not a very interesting image overall. It was just a snapshot to give a sense of the technique here. But frankly, I can imagine sitting in that bench and taking in the scenery as something that draws me to that photograph much better than I can imagine anything really with regard to that image. I am changing the relationship of the thing that is in the foreground to the thing that is in the background by using lenses that have different qualities to them. You might also notice that wide angle lenses will distort things in the foreground. There's a slight curvature to the bench that is not apparent in the normal angle of view. And so that allows for, again, a greater emphasis of anything you put close up in the foreground when you're using a wide angle lens. But let's think of another example here. This is one that of the arbors at Longwood. Very interesting, very beautiful. This is nothing to write home about for the photograph itself. It's a nice image of the arbors. But you have this hillside in the background that sort of just cuts across the middle of it, and it's rather distracting. And so that's really not anything more than a snapshot. It doesn't really hold, at least for me, too much merit as something with contemplative photography depth, if you will. If I move back a little bit and then use a telephoto setting on the zoom lens, I'm able then to make that background both larger in relation to the foreground, because telephoto lenses tend to flatten what's in the foreground against the background. And I have a narrower angle of view. So now it's still sort of a distracting image. A lot of other stuff going on there. If I was being very serious about this being an artistic image, I would have not had these people photobomb my photo right in the middle of it. But with regard to just using the zoom lenses, so you have sort of a normal angle of view, you have this slightly telephoto angle of view as I'm moving back, but it's still not what I want. So I move way back and I take a picture with a super telephoto range. And now suddenly you have a very different image where that hillside now completely fills the space that is framed by that arbor. And you have a very different image to what you had originally. Looking at the difference there and the difference there, I'm just simply changing the relationship of the foreground to the background by taking advantage of the characteristic of a telephoto lens over, say, a normal lens. Does that make sense to people? Okay. Think of your zoom lenses as being a collection of many different individual lenses, each with its own character. There's a challenge that many photographers take up, which is to choose a single focal length lens or choose a single focal length within a zoom range and shoot just that lens angle for a week, for instance. Don't vary that at all. And it really does expand your vision for what a camera can do. It expands your sense of, oh, I know what this looks like with a 35mm lens. I know what this looks like with an 80mm lens. And so you become adept at visualizing images from different focal lengths in the zoom range. And finally, I would just say something that would be a little difficult for folks with smartphones, but it's not impossible. And it's a characteristic of a lot of my photography. I mentioned earlier the idea of trying to capture luminescence. There was a documentary done about the Pixar movie people years ago, where they said during their second film, which I think was called A Bug's Life, they took a little camera and put it on the end of a stick on some wheels and rolled it through the garden at the studio in order to imagine what a bug sees from ground level. And what they discovered was that the world is luminescent from that perspective because everything is backlit. And I'd always been interested in backlighting, and that set me out to try to particularly pick up the luminescence of flowers and leaves and all around me. And I just love that. That's very much at the center of my whole practice of contemplative photography, is contemplating the luminescence of creation. Here is a poppy that just is like a little cup of sunlight. Background's a little busy, but I've tried to control that as best I can. And I just love this image. Here we have another, I guess this is probably another fern frond in bright light as it's unfurling, and you have the combination of the translucence of the young little fronds coming off of it with this marvelous little hairy cilia around it. And there's you'll notice again, I think sort of a left to right directionality to this image. You don't think of cactuses as very translucent or luminescent, but in this case, here you have this cactus. Struck my eye originally just because of the very strange combination of heart shapes and thorns, which seem to be some sort of a moral of the story or something, I don't know. But I looked around this cactus for a while until I finally was able to find an image that gave me a sense of its luminescence. The backlighting of the little cactus pieces and even some of the shadows from one to another. And here, coming to a close for the examples that I want to put forward, a leaf that I took just a couple of weeks ago, maybe about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. There's nothing particularly remarkable about this. It caught my attention in some ways. Nice little raindrops on it. It's a pretty little leaf, I suppose. But the sun is shining directly on it from above. I'm looking at it directly from on top of it. Move around behind it, and this is the same leaf, just simply moved around behind it as opposed to photographing it from on top. And there you have a very different image. The little water droplets that you see on that leaf are actually the water droplets on the other side of the leaf being shown through. You have this dramatically beautiful red as opposed to this darker red, this really luminescent red there. If you look at those side by side, same leaf, same light, same distance, everything is the same except I'm photographing from above and below. There's enormous potential, I think, in nature, and especially in the sort of photography that I do, close-up nature photography is much of it, to discover this remarkable variation in that's there in front of me just by taking a different angle of view and what's there. So I've gone on for, I think, for long enough here, but I've tried to offer some thoughts on imagining a photo as a painting and controlling the background, utilizing patterns and lines to guide the eye, watching for shadows and sharply angular light, especially for textures, being mindful of the rule of thirds, but not to be constrained by it, using zoom lenses as collections of lenses, and if possible, capturing luminescence. I close with the idea that photographs should always be what you want them to be. If they're not, then how do we work on getting them to be what you want them to be? Because it shouldn't be frustrating. It should be an exciting artistic expression. But ultimately, they are your creation. They are an expression of your aesthetic vision. Don't take photographs for other people unless you're a professional photographer who's trying to take a photograph the way somebody's paying you to take it. But don't take photographs for others. Take them for you. And a large percentage of those are going to be interesting to other people because they are not just about the thing that are being photographed. They are ultimately about you. And here I offer an image that is part of my own contemplative photography practice. I don't really show this to people very much because it's something that people don't really get or appreciate at the level that I do. I was walking one day and this little Thai plant leaf just stood out to me in this very unusual flash in my mind that it looked like a stylized silhouette of a bird. And it just made me smile, and I wanted to capture that, and I explored that with the camera. I took several pictures, and this is the one that I chose out of those pictures that helps me to go back to that moment of just seeing a bird in the tip of a leaf, just the way my mind had worked on that. And so this may not be very valuable to other people, but for my own practice, I can bring this up at any time, be drawn back to that moment of discovery and delight in that image. And the final photo I would share with you is this. This is, again, a landscape that I don't do much landscape photography there, but I wanted to show this as an illustration of how a little bit of photographic technique can enrich general photography. And that is, I just wanted to take a snapshot of this scene. I was out there. I only had an iPhone with me. And so I just pulled the iPhone out of my pocket. And what is particular about this image is that I chose to take the picture with the gritty, dark sand in the front. That wasn't very pretty. It doesn't add to the beauty of the image, in my opinion. The beauty of the image was this beautiful water and these mountains behind, and it was a nice day with a lot of blue sky. And so I think there would have been part of me that would have said, don't put that gritty beach into the picture. Just move up and take this picture of water and mountains and sky. But for me, this photograph is not about water and mountains and sky or about the beach. For me, by including the beach, this photo is about me standing there. What I have captured in this image is something that is not at all apparent to anyone else, which is the feeling of standing on that beach looking at those things rather than the things themselves. And so paying attention to what a photograph can capture sometimes goes beyond paying attention to just what's in the picture, but trying to capture the feeling that you have, trying to recapture the moment in a way, to capture it so that it can be recaptured. And so with that, I will stop my screen sharing here, if I can figure out how to do that, and come back here. And we've gone over our time already, so forgive me on that, but I hope that this was of some value, and I wanted to offer a moment at least of some comments from anybody to see if it was valuable.
Yeah, it's very interesting. First I thought like you were putting like a black poster board behind some of these things, but basically you're just using the natural setting.
Oh yeah, it's all natural light, all natural setting. There's nothing artificial around any of this. That's important. I never use a flash. And I try to work with what's there.
Okay.
The idea of this workshop is to encourage you to think of how to use the camera in some ways that maybe are about contemplative photography or just improving your photography. So that the idea is that between now and next week, actually between now and say next Monday, I would challenge everybody to think of maybe taking one or two of the techniques that are there, or another single technique. Try to take pictures with that technique in mind. Try to capture something that is of special interest to you in a contemplative photography way, and then you'll email those to me. I will pull those together in a little bit of a slide presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity to share those. This is not a critical competition. This is really just about what you saw, what you tried to take a picture of, and maybe consulting with the rest of us about what could be done to help you take the picture that you hope to take a picture of, if it isn't quite what you had in mind. We did this before when we first did the workshop in person, and it was great fun. So I don't want people to feel anxious around this. This isn't something that you need to think of taking award-winning photos. We did this and it produced some remarkable results. I remember Karen took some amazing pictures of dragonflies that were just wonderful. Hannah took some amazing photos that tried to capture the idea of the rule of thirds and offered some thoughts on that. Her sense of foreground and background bowled me over. And so it should be fun. Photography should be fun. Keep it fun. And if it's not fun, then we need to think about how to think of it in a way that lets it be fun. If it's constantly frustrating, it can't be fun, but with just a little bit of practice with all the wonders of modern cameras and the capacity of digital photography, it is just hanging right out there to be a fun activity to do.
Well, thank you to John for all of this. And I will unmute everyone for a moment of chaos if you want to share your final thoughts, or just to maybe give a little applause to thank him for the time and expertise, everything he gave us.
Well, thank you.
Oh, I lost my mic.
Okay.
We lost John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lost John? Oh, well, then I guess that would be the end,
muted.
wouldn't it? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, John, if you can hear us.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Your photos are beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful photos. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of depresses me thinking I'll never be that good with a camera.
Oh,
Competition, Carol.
Yeah.
John, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay, well, friends, have a very good evening. Thank you so much,
there it
and
is.
blessings.
Good
And we'll
Bye,
draw
Eric.
this to a close.
Thank you so
Night,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, John.
Alrighty,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye now.